My dude, did you just unfollow me on the gram?
I did.
What's going on?
Well, you just liked a post from an athlete who was sponsored by a shoe company whose president just bought a chocolate factory, and you know that one of the biggest things that the chocolate factories produce is palm oil, which is a crazy side effect which contributes to deforestation, which is one of the leading factors in climate change. So you are supporting bad climate change policies for the world.
Alrighty then. So I'm indirectly responsible for global warming by liking this post?
You are actively responsible, and you share responsibility with everyone else who's making it worse.
I'm directly responsible.
Correct.
We really should talk about ways that Christians can engage culture or be mindful of wisdom to be able to interact.
Probably.
All right, let's talk about some of that. Welcome everybody to Kingdom Thinking. Today we're going to dive into the topic of Christians and culture. So Josh, with this question, I'm not so much interested in individual preferences such as aesthetics, clothing, music, etc., different individual preferences and choices that people make. I'm more so interested in asking the question, how should Christians engage in the values that shape a culture, and what should they hope to gain from it? Mm-hmm. So I want you to tell us a little bit about the background in a survey fashion about how Christianity actually began in its relationship to culture.
Sure. So Christianity starts out as a branch of Judaism in the first century, which was at the time under the global domination of the Roman Empire. And the growth of Christianity in the ancient world is a particularly fascinating event, sociologically speaking, because it didn't come from like this major influence of power structures. It wasn't something that was super popular with like pundits or people of influence or people that mattered. It's quite literally a bottom-up approach, right? It's an underground subculture movement that literally attracted people because of its distinct values. Okay. And it's not until Emperor Constantine, who sees Christianity with favor, where he implements it into the empire, and then the influence of the Christian church in the Western world is going to develop, obviously at a rapid pace for that over the next 2,000 years. And it plays a particular, format in the way that America came to be today.
Good. So what I'd like to highlight for our viewers from that is the uniqueness of the way that Christianity related to the empire.
Sure.
It was this offshoot. It was these kind of weirdos on the side that were thinking about things very differently and treating people very differently. Their values and the way through which they interacted in society was very different, right? Mm-hmm. So as that changes and Christianity becomes a major influence on the Western world, that begins to change. Now, what's really interesting to me as it relates to what we want to talk about today is how some of that is beginning to change.
Yep.
How in some ways, right, I don't want to be over dramatic here, but in some ways, traditional Christian values are no longer the assumed foundation or starting point for which our society, particularly in American politics and American social discourse, that's no longer necessarily the starting point.
Well, and you can even go one step further and say that in a lot of ways, those kind of assumed traditional values are actually looked down upon, mm-hmm. right? They're interpreted as negative things and negative starting points as opposed to like positive corollaries that have existed.
Good. In some ways, exactly. So without being over dramatic, right?
Sure.
There are instances in which we can say, oh yeah, like that's no longer assumed. Traditional Christian values are no longer assumed. And so what we want to trace today for our viewers is two responses or two attitudes that Christians could adopt in engaging this developing phenomenon. So we want to use this analogy from the New Testament, and we're going to call attitude number one the Zealot attitude.
Yeah.
We're going to call attitude number two the Qumran attitude. So tell me a little bit more for our viewers what that means. What does that mean?
Sure. So the Zealots were people who were very engaged within Judaism and its relationship to the Roman Empire, right? Okay. So you'll notice that actually Jesus, one of his 12 disciples, his name is
Correct.
Simon the Zealot.
Yes, there was a zealot in there.
And this was the Romans would have considered zealots terrorists, right? Like they were domestic terrorists who tried to inflict damage and fear to try and cause revolution and revolt and make problems happen for the sake of trying to get the Jewish nation back into a state of independence, right?
Good.
So that's a quick summation, right? A very simplistic view of what zealots were.
Yes.
And then the Qumran community is a people that were very separatist, right? It's probably the easiest way to say this. They were people that lived in the desert. They were, think of like a hermit, right? And this kind of idea. They were people that lived alone or away in a group because they figured the world was not a good place with whom to have a relationship, right? Their job as religious, holy people was to separate themselves and be as distinct and unique as possible, even at the expense of relationship with the world as a whole.
Nice. That's awesome. So although this isn't a perfect analogy for what we're going to discuss, I do think that there is some weight and some correlation to two attitudes that we see not only in Christian scholarship, but also as it trickles down to Christian local churches, ministries, and even down to, pop culture Christianity. So the question that we really want to think about here and analyze is, what are the benefits and some of the limitations of both of these attitudes towards engaging this new, I'm going to say new with reference to, I don't know, maybe the last 5 years, how charged our context is, right? Where everything is almost dichotomized. So you're either against me or you're for me. And with this charged context that we're now in, we really want to think about, one, how should Christians gain influence, if at all? And two, what should Christians hope to gain from that influence, right? So let's talk about first about our example here, Zealots, right? Okay. So with this attitude, like you said, Zealots in the Roman Empire in the time of Jesus were Jewish people, the sect of Jewish people who wanted to militarily, right, by force, overthrow the empire to return God's kingdom. Okay. So what I draw from that, some equivalence would be a Christian posture that not only views American history in a very optimistic light with reference to its Christian foundation, but views Christianity then as the optimal point for society and for American politic and political discourse to return to. In other words, I would sum this as Christians who want to make America Christian again. So let's talk about a little bit of the benefits. What are some of the pre-understandings? What are some of the assumptions? And what are some of the limitations of that?
I think, a couple of the ideas that we see from this is, maybe there's an idea to talk about this in a way as we see what it would look like to be positive about kind of the returning to an assumed understanding of like Judeo-Christian roots for where it stands as for us as a nation. It would be very easy to go back to this kind of way of thinking because it's what we dealt in at least in terms of our rhetoric, for quite a long time, right? And it would be a discussion that would serve the current majority population in the country, right, where it is overwhelmingly white, like 60+% of the population of the country still being like that. So it would be something that would make the majority population comfortable for the short term, right? It would be something that would tamper down some of the charged rhetoric in the current moment, not where we're going right, in the next 10 or 15, 20 years in terms of population dynamic shift. There, but for the immediate stuff, it would quell. It could potentially quell some of the discourse.
So you see not only a kind of religious value correlation, but you also see like a demographic correlation relationship there. So tell me a little bit more about that.
So I don't know how long this would last, and I don't know how well this would solve the problems deeper beneath the surface, right? That you and I would probably agree both exist in our country as a whole, right? But insofar as putting a nice sheen on things or like a patina of sorts, right? The idea of being able to speak with a similar language out of some assumed correlations of Judeo-Christian values would give the overwhelming majority of people the same starting point from which to do their dialoguing. And when you both agree on some foundational understanding, it's easier to kind of move and navigate back and forth. And because there's some common ground, it's a little bit easier to potentially give and take at times.
Gotcha. So what are some things that come to your mind if I use this phrase, this slogan here, right? Like, make America Christian again. What does that mean? As far as you understand?
God back in schools.
So like prayer?
Pledge of allegiance before every type of thing. Flags in churches again. God bless America in churches, like the song being sung on like national veteran holidays, right? So
Memorial Day.
Yeah, those kinds of things. The idea of kind of more traditional or stricter Christian values in the way that we view things like marriage, right?
Okay.
So one man, one woman
That's probably
only,
a big one.
right?
Abortion's probably a big one.
Abortion's huge. Probably Second Amendment kind of conversations and things
Yes.
around there.
Yeah.
And probably like very defined gender roles, right? Like more
Okay.
specifically, kind of moving like men do X, women do Y, and understanding those things and adhering to them in a little bit more of a stringent fashion.
Okay. So you have kind of a colliding of sorts of religious values, demographic values, and then kind of like cultural values.
Yeah,
so that's fascinating.
In a very simplified way, like a Leave It to Beaver kind of old show from like the 1950s, where it's like mom is in the home and cooks all day while wearing pearls, and then dad comes home from work or whatever, and mom gives him like a pipe and slippers and dinner's ready. Like that kind of idea where it's like very simplistic in the way that it displays life for people.
Interesting. So I could see where you're coming from on that. I'm not sure if that's entirely fair.
Right. It's a little caricature. Yeah. I freely admit that, for sure.
To the perspective, because and we've talked a lot about this. A lot of the circles that I'm in, both with my church and a lot of the people that I hang out with, are going to be a lot more conservative.
Sure.
So some of the things I'm hearing from them, I think comes out of, one, I think there's a level of honesty that's there in terms of an anxiety and a fear.
Sure.
About what is it going to look like to be in a country that is maybe not even mostly influenced by Christianity, but when it becomes opposed to it.
Sure.
What is that going to look like?
Yeah.
And so a little later on, we're gonna talk about some of those specific examples.
Yeah.
So what I want to do is be as charitable as possible in saying that I think the people who would adhere to this attitude of wanting to say, hey, like, no, we should be involved in gaining influence, whether it's in media, whether it's in politics, certainly in a presidential election, right? The desire to be involved, to gain influence at first hand, I want to say that I understand the honesty and the genuineness of people who want to say, like, no, I want people to benefit from this. If America is more Christian, more people are going to benefit from this.
Well, sure, and you have, you have history to point to in some sense, right? And the idea of the prosperity of America as a whole coming out of particularly the last 100 years, right, with the world wars, kind of decimating the rest of the world and kind of leaving an open room for the economy to grow here. Like the idea of saying, a lot of those undergirding principles were found on like the idea that your word was bonds, you followed through with your actions, right? Like you didn't lie to people. Yeah, all of those things were
standing up for the underdog.
Yeah, those things were very pertinent to the idea of making our country what it was in some ways.
So having said that, what are some of the limitations that you see?
Yeah, I think probably one of the biggest ones I see is it tends to ignore what I consider a large reality and swath in American history.
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
I mean, America has struggled, I'll say, with profound racism throughout the totality of its history, not just, the conversation of slavery, but you look at the way that a lot of white groups came over and how they were treated in terms of, Ben Franklin was pretty anti-German, anti-Italian.
Right. I was going to say, like,
and so there was massive
original Italian migration.
Yeah. And so I say that to say, not to compare white and black kind of disenfranchisement at all, but more so to the conversation that America
hasn't always been easy.
Well, America's always been afraid of change. And America has always chastised change in its rhetoric because that's what human beings do. Yeah. Humans don't like change, or disruption is probably a better way to say it. And so to simply kind of paint with the brush of saying like Christian values kind of undergirded things and stuff was a lot better, it makes me feel like there's a bit of a reminiscing for a time period that never really existed.
Interesting.
Because it seems to ignore, not intentionally, right? Like I don't think it's a bad faith thing for the most part.
Yeah.
But I think it has a propensity to ignore what the reality of history
and some of the
like.
Undercurrents that were there all along.
Oh, I mean, just not even undercurrents, just things that were out in the open.
Yeah.
Right. And so it seems a little bit disingenuous of history itself to me.
I see what you're saying. So it sounds like what you're saying is an attitude of engaging with the current climate that says, hey, if we could just enforce, or I don't know if that's a fair word.
Get back to.
If we could somehow begin to support or get back to traditional Christian values, then that would solve some of these issues.
Yeah.
It seems like a simplistic solution.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems one that's not rooted in anything reality-based to me, right? So it's like we should always be pushing people to not lie. We should always be pushing for things that make it, so abortion never even needs to happen, right? Like better economic conditions, better health conditions, all of those things are great.
Yeah.
They're, but I don't know how trying to go like to traditional Christian values is going to only be the best way to solve those things, because a lot of the times those things weren't really playing out in the historical format that people are kind of saying, or to the level of which people seem to be assuming.
Okay.
Right. So I always want America to be more Christian, right? Because I think Jesus led by examples of love, inclusion, kindness. Servant leadership, all those things.
Those are all
for
great
sure.
things.
Amazing.
You're not saying they're bad.
No, not even remotely, right? Like if America was a Christian nation in the way that I define a Christian nation, right? Which is, of course, like, it's my opinion, so of course I want that there, which may not be the best opinion, by the way. There, so, but I just don't always know where the person who's having this conversation is. It's kind of a nebulous definition that can
really
shift a lot.
No, I think that's a really good point, because what kind of Christianity? Make America more Christian. Well, yeah, but what kind?
Yeah, we've got over 3,000 different denominations that have sharp divisions over sanctity of life, or sharp divisions over how we should treat the wife or the husband in the home, like sharp division over how gender roles ought to be assumed or divided, you know, whether gays can be married or not, or whatever, right? And so it's like whose community, which interpretation are we talking about?
That's fair. Yeah, that's really fair. So it's just my observation that the people that I hear mostly saying, let's make America Christian again, are the people who have the most to lose in terms of social influence.
Yeah, probably.
So as a Hispanic of, first generation of immigrant parents in a majority immigrant church, right? We don't have skin in the game in that sense.
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
So like we never had political influence, so we don't have anything to lose. So it's really interesting how that perspective would be different with people who look like me than perhaps
people who look like me. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's interesting. And I know that correlation is not always causation, right? I'm just saying that's interesting how those two factors collide, because making America Christian again has very real consequences for political benefits and influence and power that don't benefit everybody.
Yeah.
So maybe those are some of the limitations.
Or benefit people disproportionately. There, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and it's a big deal, right? Because now, especially in this recent election, the Hispanic vote was one of the most important votes to try and win. Like both Donald Trump and Joe Biden campaigned really heavily in Hispanic areas. And so as the dynamics are shifting away from kind of ensconced white power thresholds, right? And I don't say that negatively or as a slam against white people. It's like there's some natural clamor that's going to inevitably arise out of that. And some people will do it from a place of like genuine concern. And some people will just be less disingenuine, more disingenuine about how they approach it.
Yeah. The last thing I want to say on this is the level of winsome or efficiency that enforcing principles has, right? So you can think about when you were a teenager, or maybe a lot of our viewers can relate when they were teenagers. There's this natural tendency to not want to do what you're told to do.
Always.
Right? And so I wonder about the ministerial or efficiency of, hey, if we just put prayer back in schools, and if we just started saying Merry Christmas to everybody and refusing to say Happy Holidays, or like whatever the case may be, right? If we just made this back to the cultural norm, like, would that even work?
I mean, it doesn't work with most young Christians I know,
right?
And so, and that's not a slam,
no,
or to be intentional, but there genuinely seems to be what it's felt like a generational divide here in a lot of these conversations.
Correct. And so I wonder, what's the theological cost?
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking of that attitude. And how much do you lose if you want to gain that?
Yeah, I mean, you got to pick and choose your battles.
Correct.
Right? And it seems like this position has a potential pitfall to make many things a battle that don't necessarily need to be.
Yeah.
Right? And that can be a difficult position to find yourself on the wrong side of. Because you can accidentally alienate people.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I want to reiterate that our intention is always to be as charitable and to view people who hold this position as honest.
Yeah, of course.
As honest as we can.
Yeah.
For sure. So this would be our analogy of the zealot, right? Somebody who is overtly and intentionally saying we need to gain influence so that we can confront this shifting culture with that influence to regain it.
And one more positive thing to say about it, right, is like this makes sense from a very logical-minded position,
from
right?
It's a pragmatic position.
Well, I mean, government's just the most big tool in our tool belt.
Correct.
So, of course, you want to wield some type of what you perceive to be as positive influence over it
Yeah.
because you genuinely think it's going to help the most people
Yeah.
there. And so people who hold and maintain this position aren't coming at it from like a manipulative power
Correct.
grab kind of
Correct.
way. It's in a real interest of the other
Correct.
that they're trying to serve. So when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, they themselves identify this way, and so they think that this is the best way to love their neighbor.
Correct.
So don't hear, it's not like a mad set of critiques just coming out of the gate
Absolutely.
at it. Like, these are just different things that you could potentially fall into.
Correct. Good. So now as we talk about the second position, which would be our analogy, the Qumran approach, right? It would be more of a separatist approach. So what are some of the tenets, benefits, and limitations as you see them?
Sure. So these would be people who kind of think of themselves as being separated from larger society, right? So Christians who might sit out on political elections, or maybe to say this in kind of like more of a meme format, right? You'll say like, no matter who wins the presidency, Jesus is still king.
Oh my goodness.
Kind of thing, right? And just like very much leading with that and kind of sitting there, right? Like not ever really moving off of that.
Right.
Right. Or make sure you love, Jesus loves Trump voters too, or like Jesus loves Biden voters
too.
Also, and just kind of living in that zone, never really kind of doing anything else out of that.
So are there any benefits to that?
Probably, right? I mean, it makes you a lot easier to deal with at dinner parties, right, on some level. But in all seriousness, like the other side of that being, I mean, you don't get caught in the mud as easily. And I think that this is actually really underrated in this day and age, because with how much mudslinging there goes from all sides of the conversation, to be able to be less entrenched in that.
There's
is
something
a
winsome
positive
about
thing.
that.
Yeah.
There is something winsome about that.
It's very attractive.
And you know what? I'm going to just be full honest with you here. For the last 2 elections, I have, by principle, refused to vote. And so I feel very attracted to some of the underlying assumptions or pre-understandings. And I think part of it, if I would come up with a slogan for this part, it would be, so on the one hand, right, you have the Zealots who are saying we need to make America Christian again so that we can love people, right? Yeah. These people would say, no, we need to make Christianity weird again so that in America that is no longer Christian can actually see Christianity for what it is.
Yeah.
There's something really winsome about that to me, right? If I can just speak from my own personal perspective on that. And so not only have I refused to vote in that sense from my perspective, and I've had people on both sides who say, well, then you're just voting for the other candidate, right? And I was like, well, you can't have it both ways.
Well, I mean, the good news is in California, at least, you can always vote your conscience because you always know it's going to go Democrat. You don't even have to worry about it. Yeah, so it's a very practical right way to live that out.
However, I like to think that it's a principled decision in where to be
fair, the founders put abstaining, right? You were allowed to abstain from voting, and so that's a legitimate third option to take there.
So for me, I have a reluctance to marry my principal convictions to one political vehicle.
Yeah, of course.
Because I find it an insufficient method to actually express those. Now,
this is what I think is actually the most powerful argument coming out of this position is your Christianity is so much bigger than a political party. Neither one can even encapsulate probably 50% of your theological convictions. So it feels weird.
It feels like I'm betraying them.
Yeah, like wrong
by
almost.
hitching my wagon to one of those. See, that's exactly right. Now, I understand there's deficiencies with that, like in a pragmatic sense, right? And there's going to be evangelical theologians out there who are going to say, no, like you're neglecting your moral duty to care for your neighbor or whatever, right?
Sure.
Like I get that. However, what I want to highlight about this concept and this principle is that the shifting culture of America becoming more post-Christian, and what I mean by post-Christian is a society that desires to have integrity and moral values, but that no longer needs Christianity to do so.
Right.
Like what Europe's been for like a few hundred years, right? This position views that context as an opportunity rather than a threat.
Yeah.
And so I have 2 authors here that are going to exemplify this. On the one hand, I have Russell Moore, who wrote a book a few years ago, and it's called Onward. And the premise of this book by Russell Moore, now, just for our viewers out here, Russell Moore, he's a well-known evangelical leader affiliated with the Gospel Coalition, and he's also affiliated with the Southern Baptist tradition, has leadership position there as well. And so, you have one of our own, if you will, as far as evangelicalism goes, saying, guys, America, whether you like it or not, in the Bible Belt and certainly in the metropolitan cities, right, is becoming post-Christian.
Yeah.
Like, people are still going to identify as Christian, but what they mean by that is not necessarily what you think it is in sense of, traditional values. People mean a lot of different things by that. Now, rather than being frightened and running for the hills, or picking up the sword, right, as a zealot, the imagery there for a zealot, you view this as an opportunity. You view this as a chance to have conversations with people. You view this as a chance to listen to people and say, hey, so talk to me about reproductive rights.
Right.
What's your perspective on that? Or talk to me about something like equality for all and what you mean by all love is same love. Like, help me understand what you mean by that, and let's have a conversation about that. So rather than this disposition to be threatened and then likewise defensive and then go on the offensive, this opportunity to be able to learn from people and then express convictions in a way that might be foreign to them is actually missional.
Yeah.
It's actually pastoral.
Correct.
It's actually ministerial. So he views it from a very optimistic light. On the contrary, you have somebody like Rod Dreher. So he's an author, also an evangelical. He wrote a book called The Benedict Option. Now, The Benedict Option reads more like a warning. It reads more like a tombstone reading.
Sure.
Like, this is what's going to happen to Christianity, and it's already going on. And so he talks about examples such as legislation that wants to enforce healthcare practices that would include things like abortion in public schools, and then including it for Christian schools. He talks about the possibilities of financial funding, or what's called Title IV funds, not being available to Christian schools if they don't comply. Really interestingly enough, the school where I work at Biola University, actually was facing a case like this. And so these kinds of things that Rod Dreher is addressing lead him to think more pessimistically about the situation and taking an attitude of, you better get ready, because the church might need to go underground. You might not have media access. You're certainly not going to have political access for influence. So your influence is going to be your direct network.
Right.
And so these are two interesting perspectives from two very educated people. And I have a very recent example for you, actually, that I want to kind of get your thoughts on. The Human Rights Campaign. Okay. And the Human Rights Campaign is a group that since 1980s, they've been an advocate group for LGBTQ rights. And so they wrote a letter to President-elect Joe Biden. And in this letter, they're requesting that accreditation be taken away from all Christian institutions like schools, universities, that do not comply or do not accept some of these equality views. Now, I know we've talked a little bit about this before,
Sure.
and I know you've said that you say, oh man, but like, this is nothing new. This is kind of boogeyman-ish. This is not a real threat. But I got to tell you, for a lot of people, especially that are in my circles, like, this is the kind of stuff that keeps them up at night.
Sure. Yeah. So when I say it's not a real threat, I don't mean that it in the sense that like it could never happen. I think it very well could happen.
Okay.
But I don't know how that's supposed to change how we behave, right? And this is my critique of like this positional conversation as a whole. It's like, when we read everything in the New Testament, Jesus lived a very specific life, consequences be damned, right? Paul lived a very specific life, consequences be damned. So did the first 200 or 300 years of early Christian martyrs. So did the disciples.
Yeah.
And so the ever-shifting landscape of political whatever around us doesn't, for me, I would like to at least say in theory, right?
Yeah.
Like, I've never been faced with that level of persecution, so I don't know.
Right.
There, but for me, in theory, isn't going to alter how I live, right? And so Christianity adapts, it molds well, it finds crevices and corners to grow. It often flourishes under persecution type regimes or whatever, and always has. And so the dynamic of power shifting away from Christians on a political level, in my opinion, will probably be one of the best things that ever happens to American Christianity, if I'm putting all of my cards on the table.
Yeah.
And so the idea of taking away my funding or my whatever, it's like, I don't care. Like, if I have a specific position that I read in Scripture, I'm going to withhold to that position in Scripture, irrespective of what earthly consequences I endure from that. And so I don't have a reason to be afraid of whatever. So I don't think it's not a threat in the sense that it will never happen. I do think it's very likely.
I see what you're saying.
There, but I just don't think it's something worth being up at night about, because we already believe in the person who's already won everything. So what's going to happen to me here that's more important or conversational? That's a very hey, I'm a cool guy view, and so I freely admit that, right? Like, I'm totally there on that. But I would just encourage people. It's like, if you believe a guy came back from the dead and you stake your life on that, then he'll probably take care of you in whatever you go through on an earthly situation. Right. Or if he chooses not to, then you get to go to heaven. Like, there's no downside for us in this conversation.
Right.
That I'm seeing, at least. So that's what I mean. It's not a combative approach, like people need to stop whining. I don't think that's it by any stretch of the imagination.
Gotcha.
I just don't think we have reason
that's good
to be optimistic about the way we interact with the world.
Right. So rather than being afraid for America not being Christian again, we should be courageous for what America will be, because it's what Christianity was.
No, we should cheer for it. Yeah. We should go try and get it there, because
it's good.
That's where we see it always flourishing. Is in these mixing situations of politics and Christianity.
I think that's a great way to summarize that. So, what do you guys think? What position do you find most attractive? What are some of the limitations? Did we miss something there that you think would be really important for either what we're calling the Zealot or the Qumran position? Leave us a comment and tune in next time on Kingdom Thinking.